Thank you for checking out Lakehead International's videos. You're about to watch one of our Lakehead International live webinars, a fun and informative way to learn more about Lakehead while also meeting faculty, staff, and current students. If you have any questions throughout today's video, please comment below. Otherwise, let's get started. Hello everyone and welcome to another Lakehead International Live. My name is Jordan Ball. I'll be your host today. First and foremost, I want to take this opportunity to say thank you to our audience for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you, and we're excited to be kicking off our International Lecture Showcase series with a special guest who's joined us before for one of these events. And we're excited to have him back and welcome Dr. Benjamin Maiangwa, who is one of our assistant professors in political science. So I'll give him about 20 seconds to say hello and introduce himself, and then I'll chat a bit about upcoming steps.
Thank you so much, Jordan. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this lecture. My name is Benjamin Maiangwa, and I'm an assistant professor in the political science department. I teach courses in global terrorism, introduction to terrorism, international peace building, fostering political voice. And my today's lecture would be on conflict transformation, so transforming interpersonal and communal conflict. Thank you. Okay, great. So like I said, my lecture is titled Transforming Interpersonal and Communal Conflict. One of my interests is peace and conflict studies, as well as political science. And so I thought maybe we should talk on something that we are familiar with, and that is conflict. I would like this lecture to be quite engaging, and that is I would be asking us questions along the way. So please use the chat function. And one of the questions would be, what are some of the myths that we know about conflict? What is it that you know about conflict generally? What have people told you about conflict? What have you learned about conflict so far? You could use the chat function if you want. I could give an example. So for the myth, we have that conflict is dysfunctional. That is, that conflict is terrible, is bad. Indeed, that conflict is caused by differing mindset and opinions or cultures. Thank you. Ashley. Any other myth? That conflict must always be violent. Indeed. Sometimes we make that assumption that conflict and violence are one and the same thing. But are they? That conflict must always be violent. Thank you. I'll give another example. That conflict represents the breakdown of communication. And again, in the chat, a conflict is necessary for advance in relationships after found solutions. Thank you. That would fall under the truth, as we would get to it quickly. That conflict is always an attack on another person's mindset, ideology. Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much for your contribution. We also have here that if you avoid conflict, eventually it will go away. And we know that for some people, the disposition is flight or avoidance of conflict. That in conflict, we must always, at the end of the day, have a winner and a loser, right? That one person has to lose, especially if you're having an argument, right? That one person has to win and another person has to lose. So the win-lose scenario. Can we have a win-win, however? Now, what are some of the truths? I think someone had already said it in the chat about building relationships, but that communication is a must. We have to talk until a solution is reached. And this is for people who are disposed to collaborating. And collaboration is one of the conflict management styles. That conflict can help build relationships, again, to emphasize on that point in the chat. That conflict can be a motivator for change, not just personal change. This could also be organizational change, right? That conflict is actually a must in an organization, and we need it in order to effect changes, to know whether we are growing or not. And that conflict can be managed. They are not all destructive. We can manage conflict. there are various styles of managing conflict, but maybe we can talk about them subsequently. And people deal with conflict by fight or flight. Some people stay to confront conflict head on, whereas other people flee. All right, so conflict in itself, what does it mean? I know in the chat, someone says something about, I need to go back to the chat again. I think about mindset and perception. We're getting very close to the definition, and there are a lot of definitions. There isn't one that is cast in stone here. So conflict in itself is from the Latin term. A lot of words come from Latin and Greek. Early 15th century, to contend, to fight, to struggle, from the Latin conflictus. Another definition of it, when used as a noun, so the initial one is when used as a verb, is an encounter, and not just any kind of encounter. And this is where I guess the distinction has to be made between conflict and violence, but it's an armed encounter, it's a battle. And so you hear people say violent conflict, or even in certain instances, war. So we could use it as a noun. We could also use it as a verb. Now, to understand this paradox of the term itself, that conflict can both be constructive and it can also present us with opportunities. The Chinese term here gives us a great insight. I'm not good with reading Chinese characters, but I was told it means wei ji, and that wei in this instance means danger, and ji in this instance means opportunity. So depending on how you use it, how you perceived it, how you manage it, conflict could both be or present us with dangerous circumstances, but also opportunities. I could see a hand raised here by Abu David. Do you have a question?
For anyone that has a question, you can certainly raise the hand function, but you'll still submit them using the webinar chat. So I'll encourage everyone, if you have thoughts around some of the ideas that Dr. Maiangwa is sharing, of course, we welcome those ideas and we want to deconstruct them a bit further. So please don't hesitate to participate using the webinar chat, or of course, if you want to pose a question, you can also use the Q&A feature.
Thank you. Right. So indeed, that the Chinese word for crisis is danger and opportunity, in which case that in every crisis situation, there is destruction, there is danger, but there is also an opportunity for growth, depending on your perspective, right? Sometimes we hear people ask, do you see the glass half full or half empty, right? In that sense. So if you perceive that it is indeed possible to grow out of this situation, then you would always see opportunities for growth. Now, let's take us from Chinese words to Hausa. Hausa is a language spoken in West Africa. And I want to cite a few proverbs in this language to again give us the sense that conflict presents us with, different scenarios. So one of these proverbs is Zomo Zona, Zomo Saba. Let us live together. Let's have disagreement. Again, this paradox that conflict presents us with, that living together is also similar to having disagreement. You can't live together without having disagreement. Another proverb says, Harshe da hakorima anasavawa. A tongue and tooth also do have discrepancies, right? Sometimes you bite your tongue while eating, right? That happens, right? And they are all housed together in your mouth. So that, people could be in the same household and still, get into conflict. Another one here is, don't worry, Garkaya. A brother is a coat of thorn. We hear sometimes people say, family is family. No matter what happens, you can't deny a family member, regardless, what they might have done. Okay, so these are just a few sayings. I'm showing so many language or languages, there are, proverbs like this to emphasize the point again that, conflict could both be destructive and conflict could also present us with opportunities. And if you have any questions so far, please do put it in the chat and I'll get to it in a moment. I would like to read a case or a scenario for us. And maybe after reading this, it will be my turn to ask us questions. And it goes, a group of missionary folks, Christian missionaries in this sense, they went into a village and they asked for a land to build a church. The community did not understand who they were or what their mission was, right? So they came speaking even in a foreign language, but the community was like, we don't get you entirely, but we're gonna give you the land, all right? So these folks were given the land and they built their church, and then they started sending people into the village to convert the villagers to Christianity. Okay, does this sound familiar? Maybe not now, but in those days, I think part of colonization was also through the missionaries. So they did so through peaceful proselytization measures, right? So they go in and ask people if they would be interested in coming to join their church. After a while, the elders in this village got frustrated with the missionaries, and they felt that they were leading, or properly speaking, misleading their people into destruction by changing their cultural ways. And so they summoned these missionaries and asked them to leave the village. Now, this is just a simple scenario. And if we take any maybe novel by an African writer, novels written in the 50s and the 60s, we will see a lot of stories, especially Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, like missionaries coming into the village and a lot of young people, instead of going to the farm, they ended up spending a lot of time at church, right, with the missionaries. And the elders were not so pleased, by that, and felt the missionaries were changing the cultural practices of the people. I'll go to the chat quickly and read 2 questions here, or maybe 1. I don't think there are questions. One says conflict must always be direct. Conflict is always an attack on another person. All right, great. So this is the scenario we have, and I have a few questions for us. What is at stake here? So I've read the scenario. Missionaries came, asked for a land, given a land, built a church, and started proselytizing, or at least converting young people to Christianity. And I put a few things here: resources, ideology, loss of culture, values, etc. Is there anything we would add to what we think is at stake in this particular scenario?
Maybe I'll jump in here. And in my own reflection, I think that perhaps the elders in this case are losing a sense of familiarity, something that they're so used to in terms of things that they cherish. So whether those are the resources, the ideology, or their culture, their values, it's that familiarity that they're so used to that they see perhaps is changing or shifting. And change can be scary for many people.
Right, right. Thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah, a lot of people prefer, their comfort zone, and they also may be afraid of adulterating their cultures. Like, we are not sure about a foreign culture coming in here, and we don't know you entirely. And so, they were a bit apprehensive and asked the missionaries to leave. Thank you, Jordan. I know we have a comment in the chat about the difference between conflict resolution, and I'm going to get to that soon. And I think this is an elaboration of that Chinese concept. Do you think there is a difference in conflict resolution or approaching the conflict between the Latin-derived cultures and others like the Chinese or West Africans, since the word Conflictus only means to oppose, but weji means both danger and opportunity, or in the Hausa language, where, like I saw you said, it's less just about black and white, but more socially involved. You're right, a lot of cultures have different approaches, right, to conflict. And we're going to get to that in a bit. I'm going to use only one approach. So it's great that you're actually thinking ahead of me. So thank you very much. Now, the next thing I have here, is there even conflict here, right? What indeed is the conflict between the villagers and the missionaries? Again, feel free to put in the chat to elaborate on these questions. And I have another one here. If there is, what type of conflict is it? So remember the title is transforming, interpersonal and communal conflict. Is this an example of communal conflict? And even if it is communal conflict, what type of communal conflict is it? Is it interracial, right? Remember I said it's an African village. Is this intergroup conflict? Is this interreligious conflict, right? Because I guess the perspective of the missionaries coming in is that maybe we are the first bringing some form of religion to these people, whereas the people felt like they've always had their own religious beliefs. So there are also other forms that the conflict could be subsumed under. Who is the aggressor and who is the victim? Is there an aggressor in this scenario? By aggressor, I mean, is there someone who is out there looking for trouble, to put it plainly, or the violent one in this sense? And does aggressor actually mean, physical violence, right? And this is something we need to rethink when we think about victims and perpetrators, right, of conflict. That there are instances in which victims are not really victims, right? Victims could also be complicit in perpetrating conflict, and perpetrators are also not, perpetrators in the strict sense of the term, depending on our perception, but also depending on the passage of time. Victims could become perpetrators, perpetrators could become victims. I think a great example of this is Rwanda. We've heard a lot about the Rwandan genocide of 1994, where almost 1 million people died. Genocide carried out by, mostly at a time, we don't use this concept today, Hutu rebels, right, or extremists against the Tutsis. Now, in the past, the Tutsis were regarded as the perpetrators during the Belgian colonization because they had the power. And a lot of the Hutus felt aggrieved by that. There was a civil war in which, they were defeated. And then eventually in 1994, it was the turn of the Hutus against, the Tutsis, right? So who is the aggressor and who is the victim? Who is right here? And is it even useful to ask the question about right, or should we ask the question about justice? So even if we agree that there is conflict, the situation, you would agree with me, also looks benign. Like, what is the big deal? There is no use of force or ammunition. We didn't compel you to give us your land. We came pleading and asking you that, please, we need to erect a building here. And out of the goodness of your heart, you gave us the land. Now, there is a saying, this is a saying in some part of Africa that, when the missionaries came, we had the land, they had the Bible, and they taught us to pray with our eyes closed. And when we opened them, they had the land and we had the Bible, right? So for a lot of people, they use the Bible to take the land from them. So there is some form of, deceit, if you would see it in that sense. But again, what is the issue here? Everything looks benign. They came, they asked, they got what they wanted, and they're asking people to come to their church out of out of their own volition or free will. So the cause of conflict is not always easy to determine. I think that is what this case presents. It's not really easy to say what is at issue here, right? Of course, we could highlight, the change that people weren't comfortable with, ideological differences, the fear of the loss of culture and values, and so on. And again, that understanding the concept of victim and aggressor is also not straightforward, right? Like I hinted with the case of Rwanda. So let's try to define conflict, because our scenario, before we even define conflict, our scenario could be linked. We may think that this is not happening today. This is basically frozen in time during probably colonization of many parts of Africa or even Asia for that matter. But our scenario could also be linked to contemporary understanding of humanitarianism and liberal peace building. And by liberal peace building, I mean, peace building from the top to the bottom, peace building from international organizations. How many times have we seen, international organizations going into conflict-ravaged societies and, taking pictures of people that did not really consent to have their pictures taken and so on, right? But it doesn't mean liberal peace building is not useful. So international humanitarianism, liberal peace building, they often go with the posture to save people, to salvage people, to redeem a people in bondage. People that probably are volatile, right? The idea that, let's go teach these people how to live peacefully in their own village. Sometimes we forget that people actually do have their cultural resources, like I think someone put it in the chat, the difference from the Latin and the Chinese ways of resolving conflict, that people indeed do have ways of resolving conflict, and we need to take those ways into consideration if we want to work, with people to help them resolve their conflict. Humanitarian peace building or liberal peace building, sometimes it lacks local sensibilities. We go in there without knowledge of the language. So remember, I use certain Hausa proverbs and Chinese concept. We have no knowledge of the language that people use. And so we lack in an essential commodity. So we may think we're taking in money and we're taking in health resources and so on. But sometimes even the lack of language could be a disadvantage if you are an external peace builder. But again, it can be a necessary evil. We know that in situations of conflict in a maybe impoverished society, they might be lacking food, right? And we can cite so many cases today. The war going on in Gaza, for example, people are clamoring for food, access to food, for example, right? In Ukraine, in Congo, in Somalia, in Sudan, and Nigeria, Central African Republic, there is a need for the international community to act. So the problem is not that, the international community should not go into those contexts, but how, right? How should you approach local conflict? So how then do we define conflict? A definition here by this author says, conflict is a struggle, a context between people with opposing needs, ideas, beliefs, values, or goals. And here we can maybe allude to our scenario to see that, there are opposing beliefs, right? Religious beliefs, to be more precise. But is that the only definition? Having opposing need, does it make you or at least does it pit you into conflict with someone having different ideas? Can't Christians and Muslims and Buddhists and Shintoists and so on, can they all live together? Is it possible to have people with opposing ideas live together? We are all here with different ideas, and we can all sit and listen to the lecture and contribute, and we have different perspectives on life, right? So indeed, having opposing needs, ideas, beliefs, values, or goals is not sufficient in itself to steer conflict. Conflict as incompatible activities. One person's actions interfere, obstruct, or in some way get in the way of another's action, right? That is another definition. The basis of conflict is usually a disagreement. Sometimes we say conflict is a disagreement, contradiction, incompatibility of positions, right? political values, of opinions. Again, we are still regurgitating this same idea of opposing ideas, of beliefs, of values. This is, I guess, the mainstream understanding of conflict. Another broad definition here says, is any situation in which there are incompatible goals, there are incompatible emotions within or between individuals that lead to opposition or antagonistic interaction. So certain incompatible goals may actually lead to constructive resolution of those goals, right? Whereas some could lead to antagonistic interaction. Why so? Because sometimes we perceive things differently. And I think someone put perception in the chat. And this is another definition that gets to that conflict can be defined as a situation in which two or more parties have incompatible objectives. And the second part is more important, and in which their perceptions and behavior are commensurate with that incompatibility. So if indeed you think you have incompatible goals and you perceive the other person as different from you in every sense of the word, that will match also your action. You don't see any pathway of growth or reaching some sort of consensus, then indeed that already creates a basis of conflict. I want to pause here and read a few things in the chat. According to Ashley, I think this is a question. Is it ever possible for more than one type of conflict to be occurring in a situation? That is true. We could talk about interracial, interreligious, right? Intercommunal, and so on. For example, this scenario where one could say both religion and race come in. Indeed, you're right, Ashley. There could be one or two factors at play, and depending on where you see it or your own perception. Another question here is, do you believe that a large part of the issue with certain peace-building method is that there is a preconceived sense of pity and a presumption that certain groups of people are less fortunate or without structure? Indeed, and it was my point all along that, we consider certain people as impoverished. Now, people could be impoverished materially because the capitalist society has taught us to think on material terms, whereas people could be rich in other instances, intangible resources, right? In terms of relationships, right? Community building, and so on. And we don't take into consideration those factors as well. So you are indeed right. This sense of pity and assumption that, because people may not have the access to health care that we have here, but do they have access to their own kinds of health care, right? Do they have access to organic food, for example? And maybe we are the ones eating poison, according to them. And they actually, cultivate, their own food, and they survive on base of the land, right? So you are indeed right that this perception or preconceived sense of pity could be one of the issues with international humanitarianism. If the parties perceive the conflict as being impossible to resolve or the opponent to be untrustworthy, this might not help in resolving the conflict. In conflict analysis and resolution, there is something called separating the person from the problem. Sometimes we say the person is the problem, right? But the person is just like you, having their own ideas and perceptions. And can you separate the issue that they've got and be hard on the issue and soft on the person, right? So a lot of conflict transformation expert will say, try as best you can in every instance to consider the issue and focus on the issue on its own merit and be soft on the person. See the person as, the one having the issue, but not the issue in themselves. Jordan, did you have a question?
I did, yeah. On the note of this idea that oftentimes parties that are involved in conflict may not be able to see the other side's point of view, What role do you see that mediators play in terms of we've seen on the international scale, countries that are not involved in the conflict will host delegations from both sides and host that conversation. How do they facilitate that conversation to perhaps help each party perceive the conflict at hand in a different light?
Right. I mean, that is an important question because even deciding who a mediator should be in a particular conflict is an essential part of the conflict resolution, right? Internationally, we don't seek the inputs of the warring parties. We sometimes just profile a mediator and recommend an external mediator. This could be somebody working for the UN. But the best approach is actually to ask the parties, like, who do they deem fit, right, to help them reach a consensus on this particular conflict. And sometimes when we talk to warring parties, they would suggest people in their communities. They could suggest an elder who is familiar with the issue, right, who might have had an experience resolving the issue. So a mediator has to come into the context with the knowledge of the context and knowledge of the conflict, and sometimes even knowledge of the parties involved, right? And then get the parties, depending on whatever method they are using. There are so many different types of methods. Indigenous people here, we use the talking cycle sometimes and give people the opportunity to each express their grievances. And instead of just having the parties together in a closed door, like we do at international gatherings, you actually bring some members of the community because certain communities believe that conflict does not just harm the warring parties, conflict also harm the community as a whole, right? And even our alternative dispute resolution mechanism, sometimes we're being encouraged to come with a support system. This could be a family member. They may not necessarily have a say there, but the presence or their presence, could help one of the parties or both, to feel at peace, to be able to reach a consensus or a resolution. So the external party definitely must have knowledge, and the person must also have legitimacy. They must be seen as legitimate by both parties. It will be my short response to your question.
Thank you. I'm drawing connections already from earlier in your slides where you discussed, of course, the idea of the approach to defining conflict in the Mandarin language versus the Husa, and then how you perceive conflict in that sense. So having a mediator, I think it's important reflecting on that as who are the warring parties and what do they value in terms of having that mediator? Because if it's warring parties here in Canada, it may look very different than perhaps in Africa or South America or anywhere else in the world. You really need to look inward to see what do they expect to get from this, and who do they value in terms of their trust and placing that conversation in that person's hands, perhaps.
Thank you. And in addition to that, the place is also important. Where do you resolve the conflict, right? Sometimes I want to resolve it outside of the community in a neutral setting. Sometimes for their own safety, that is, right? Because there are spoilers, and spoilers are also important in the resolution. Spoilers are people who may not want peace, right? Who may want the conflict to linger. And you have to actually reach out to them to ask why, to understand why they might be maintaining that posture. So the place as well as the mediator, I think these are all important factors to consider in conflict resolution. Is conflict the same thing as violence? Certainly not. Conflict could degenerate and be destructive and become violent, but conflict could just be an easy, simple, or even complex disagreements, right? Based on some of the reasons that we've described so far. And then when it gets to violence, we are no longer talking about conflict, we're talking about violent conflict. And sometimes when we want to emphasize that point, we need to add that violent or violence to it, right? This is a case of violent conflict or violent crime or war, for example. We could use war to describe a large scale, violence going on, for example, in Gaza and in Ukraine. as well as Sudan. So what is the life cycle of a conflict? How does it start? In so many organizations, we talk about the life cycle of a crisis or an issue from the moment you notice it to the moment you do something about it and resolve it. According to some scholars of conflict, there are 5 levels of conflict intensity. So it evolves from one level of intensity to another. So we have a moment of stable peace. There is conflict, but tension between the parties is low, and there exist different forms of connections and cooperation between them. Parties are still very hopeful at this stage. We call it the stable peace stage. The second is unstable peace. Now, tension has moved to another level. It has increased by a bit. And this is a situation where the tension between the parties is so high that peace no longer seems guaranteed, or at least between them. They're reaching what certain scholars may call a standoff, right? Whereby sometimes parties could get tired, a hurting stalemate. You know, when you reach that place, you're tired, you have conflict fatigue, you know, probably you may need some sort of mediation, or it may escalate. So then there is an open conflict if there is no mediation. An open conflict is when the conflict takes place proper and the parties have taken measures now, you know, to deal with it. In the war phase, there is widespread. When you don't deal with it, then it can escalate into violence. Now, we could apply this in a workplace situation. We could apply this interpersonally. It may not be like widespread violence. It may not even be direct violence. There are different forms of violence. We have direct, we have structural violence, right? Violence could also be through words, you know, emotional violence, you know, and so on. And so if we don't deal with it, it gets to that point of violence. I want to check the chat quickly. Do nationalism, communism, Islamism cause conflict? Yes, depending on how you practice these ideologies. Ideologies are ideologies. A lot of people will say most of the isms could be extreme, right? Extreme nationalism, extreme pride could lead to ordering of another group, for example. But pride in itself in your culture is essential, is good, is great. But extreme form of that, you know, if it comes at the expense of another person who does not belong to your culture, but sometimes who is trying to relate with your culture, then that could also lead to conflict. Islamism is also sometimes considered an extreme form of Islam, right? And this we see with radical, and sometimes you need to add the radical aspect to it. Radical Islamism, right? These are people who misinterpret scriptural texts, you know, for their own selfish gains. Communism, I think, is what you also meant here. Could also lead to conflict, certainly. We know, according to Marx, that the end result is that the proletariat, the masses, will rise against the bourgeois class, right, and take over. So a revolution in itself could be, you know, considered a violent conflict. But is violence good in certain instances? I would leave that as a question. So moving forward, in the de-escalation phase, the pattern is reverse, moving from war to crisis through open conflict, unstable peace. Finally, so it's like a cycle. We're starting with stable peace, and the point is to go back to that phase if we're not able to maintain it, right? So at that de-escalation phase, the pattern is reversed, moving from war to crisis through open conflict, unstable peace to finally reach a situation of stable peace. So from what we have been discussing so far, I'm looking at the time. I will stop in a moment. Conflict could both be constructive and destructive, right? That constructive conflict means conflicts are part of human life and we shouldn't avoid them. They allow for growth, development, and freedom to take place. Conflict doesn't have to be violent if we notice it and we try to do something about it. Conflict is a relationship between persons or groups. One or more parties hold the position that they have incompatible goal, but they don't really use that to denigrate the other person. Let's move to destructive conflict. It is characterized by violence and other destructive outcomes, narrowly defined. When you are narrow-minded or rigid, you are afraid of change, like probably in that community, and maybe they have a right to be afraid of change. Maybe there is a time for change. Maybe it wasn't the right time for them. It was too early. So it may produce negative results. Adversaries hold on the notion that their position, their interests, values are not open. I'm not moving an inch, somebody might say, right? I'm not changing this position. I'm not moving an inch for you, right? So once you go into conflict with that mindset, of course, it's already destructive. Individuals become less flexible, and it is about winning and the other person losing. And when you can't win, sometimes you start using personal attacks, attacking the name, the language, the group, the race, and even a threat. And there is a general tone of hostility as well. I have a few things, but maybe I should stop here at this level. Just, to conclude, to say that I was speaking to one of my students, and one of the ways of resolving conflict is that we need to retrieve our stories of the past, right? We need to start sharing stories to understand each other more and to know our cultures better. So like those missionaries coming into a new community, they have to sit with the groups, not just ask for land. They have to learn their language. They have to learn their history and see to what extent, there are similarities, but also differences. One of my students in class says this: as a young boy, I remember seeing my mother, my grandmother, my aunties, my cousins sitting around playing cards, talking. I can still hear the laughter of those women in our home. At the time, I thought they just liked to play cards and joke around with each other, although it was not always joking. Now and then, an argument would happen. As I got older and learned more from my grandmother, I knew what was happening at those card games. Governance. Our way of governance was not putting on suits and ties like me. It was not men in a grand hall screaming back and forth at each other. It was getting together in a good way, sharing stories, sharing problems, sharing solutions, and most importantly, sharing respect for each other. And I'm going to stop here just with this example of how, conflict could be resolved simply by sitting down and listening to another person talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy you ended on the storytelling piece here, because I think this is a perfect example of the constructive conflict, where it doesn't need to become destructive. It actually could mean sharing respect for each other and having those conversations. Um, it could pay off in leaps and bounds, perhaps. I myself was struggling to put in perspective. I think that naturally the deconstructive conflict is sensationalized, and it's what we see on the news. It's what, it sounds horrible perhaps, but it's what makes good television. I mean, the photos, the videos that we see day in and day out of active war zones is horrible, and it is thought-provoking. But the constructive conflict is much harder almost to showcase. And so I was trying to reason with myself, what did that look like, and what is constructive conflict? Because I'm sure if you ask someone without hearing this lecture today, they may think all conflict is not helpful, that there's no gain to conflict. So thank you again for sharing more. We do have a few Q&As that are open in the chat there that I know that you wanted to come back to. Two from Hung Lam, and then there's a third question there from a different student. So I'll let you take the opportunity to answer those perhaps, and then we'll see where we land on time.
Okay, so the first one here: when a conflict is raised as a proxy conflict, like during the times of the Cold War, do you think that the definitions of conflict that we just discussed could be applied, or is it another realm of its own? It could be applied for sure, but that is a really good question. Somebody would, not somebody, a conflict scholar propounds an idea of understanding conflict at the individual, the state, and the international system. This is Kenneth Walls, right? And to understand proxy conflict, we need to take it a step further to the international system. We need to leave the individual. The individual definitely is part of it, right? We understand the choices that people make even at the international system, whether they are realists, whether they are idealists, and so on. But the whole idea of power and hegemony at the international system could be some of the reasons for the proxy war or wars during the Cold War, right? And by power and hegemony here, I mean, of course, the contest between capitalism and communism, represented by the Soviet Union and the United States. And so at the international level, the understanding in politics is that the international level is an anarchic system, right? It's an anarchic system where states are seeking self-preservation. They want to preserve themselves. And it often happens at the expense of others. So the powerful state, they preserve themselves better at the expense of even the less powerful state. So that is a good question. And if we understand conflict from that level, personal, interpersonal, state level, international level, considered an anarchic system, and given the ideologies of those leaders at that level, whether they are realists, whether they are reading books by Machiavelli, for example, it could determine the manner in which they cooperate or at least relates with other states at that level. Thank you. And the other question is, there are always many conflicts between people. I think whether there is a common goal matters. If people can't find a shared target of value, conflict will cause harsh situations. So I think this is more of a comment, and I think you are perfectly right. When people cannot find common goal, conflict could result. And sometimes when that happens, we say they have reached a hurting stalemate, right? And the conflict will resolve itself just by that, that they have reached that stalemate. They can no longer, move ahead with the conflict, and they are tired, and a resolution could happen naturally, or they may need somebody as a result. Thank you.
There's another question and comment in the webinar chat. I'll let you read that first one.
Okay. So this is by Moses. I believe a significant level of tolerance for one another is key to mitigate the degree at which most of this conflict occur. However, tolerance sometimes comes with the cost of cultural distortion, power degradation, and so on. If this ideology is true, how can one find a balance between these conflicting systems? Now, it really depends. There is always this dichotomy between whether you want to be non-violent or violent. And if you are one, you have to persist in it, right? So depending on your own ideology, and we've seen this with, for example, during the civil rights, with Martin Luther, but even in India with Gandhi, with Mother Teresa, with Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela started violently, right? And he was the leader of the armed group of the ANC, African National Congress Party. But after he was in prison, he came out of prison, he became a much more tolerant, accommodating person, right? And that was what he preached and was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Even the person spearheading the apartheid regime also got the Nobel, F.W. de Klerk, also got the Nobel Peace Prize. So sometimes experiences could move people, from their level of intolerance to tolerance, just like with the case of Mandela. And it wasn't necessarily the case that he was intolerant because he wanted to be intolerant. He was fighting an unjust system, but he thought that violence could help him at that point. And after his imprisonment, he took on a different posture. So I think experiences could shape one's disposition along the way.
Thank you very much for the information. I'm looking at the time now, folks. It looks like we have a few minutes left. So I will remind you, if you have any other outstanding questions for Dr. Maiangwa, of course, this is what we're here for today, is to answer them and perhaps chat a bit more about conflict as an idea. I'm sharing similar feelings to a lot of the chat right now. Thank you so much for your time and the information that you've shared. And of course, just sharing your knowledge with us has been a great learning lesson for myself, and looks like many of our guests as well on today's webinar. Of course, to our audience, if you're watching this as a recording, and perhaps you have questions of your own that are popping up, I would encourage you to check out the timetables and see what schedules might work for you to perhaps participate in one of Dr. Maiangwa's classes when you join us here at Lakehead University. I will take this opportunity to share my screen once again and remind viewers where you can find us and stay connected, of course. You can follow us on social media at Lakehead International on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. You can also explore our beautiful campuses in Thunder Bay as well as Aurelia from the comfort of your own home. So you don't need to travel all the way here to Canada quite yet. You can join us online at lakeheadu.ca/tours. With that being said, thank you again to our special guest, Dr. Maiangwa. Thank you to our panelists behind the scenes for helping support today's event. It's been my pleasure being your host, but I'll wrap it up here and say thank you, and hopefully we'll see you soon. Bye for now, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any questions, I want to encourage you to comment below or connect with us on social media. We can be found at Lakehead International on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Thanks for watching once again, and hopefully we'll see you at the next live webinar. Bye for now.